What's up, Flannelverse? What's up, Endgamers? Adam and I are back to talk through the Thursday night football slate. This is Texans at Jets. Should be an interesting one. Some moving parts here, some injuries, some trade has affected the way these teams play. So should be a fun one to break down. We are, as usual, going to go position by position: quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, tight ends, defenses, kickers. We're not going to do the lineups portion at the end of this show. That is for the evening show that I do solo. If you're not already subscribed, please make sure you do subscribe to the Flannelverse and the Endgame channels. Adam and I are both trying to grow our YouTube channels. We're pretty new on YouTube, so would appreciate any of you subscribing, liking, commenting, all of that. Very helpful. If you are on one channel, make sure you're subscribed to the other channel. That would be very much appreciated. Adam, how are you doing today?
Doing pretty good. Happy to be back talking football after taking Monday off.
Yeah, that was I was I think you and I were both on the same page of like, I just can't do it today. Like I was so tired on Monday morning when and I woke up for it. So I wish I had reached out to you the night before so that I wouldn't have set an alarm. But
I would. I mean, the night before I would have told you that I was good to go. So
okay, yeah. So that was
I woke up. Anybody that's watched my shows for a while knows that whenever I'm staying at my mom's, I inevitably get sick because I'm allergic to dogs and not used to being around dogs anymore. So I woke up Monday and was just like, I'm not doing a show where I'm just blowing my nose the whole time.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Also, I guess I take it back. I'm glad that I woke up because I still had a deadline to do all of my expert surveys for NFL and NBA. It was the first day that we had Monday NBA for me, so that was I actually used the time to do NBA work instead. So
and probably not best to skip those things like a day before massive layoffs.
Also, I mean, I'm not at risk of being laid off because I'm not an employee, but yes,
I don't make enough money to get laid off.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Like that's what people don't understand. It's like, why would you let go of Squirrel Patrol? He's so awesome. He's so good at DFS, and it's like accurate. This is, I mean, you and I got fired because he's expensive because he's a full-time. I assume he's a full-time employee. So it's not like they like chose those of us who remained over him. It was like, yep, we cut the most expensive people, and it's kind of how it goes.
Yeah, there's kind of a competing incentives where like the better, especially with DFS, just because of like the way the game is, like the better you are at DFS, the more you need to get paid for it to be worth it for you to go talk about DFS.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. All right. We're going to go position by position. Like I said, Adam, we got some blowback when we did the Taylor Mathis drama. We apparently was 7 minutes into the show before we started talking about football, and people were pissed. I got multiple comments about it. It's like, I guess these people are not used to our shows. Like that's just kind of how it goes on a live show. This is not meant to be a 20-minute thing. This is I don't know. It's always funny getting that blowback. Back in our stochastic days, we would have intentionally delayed.
Talk about for 20 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. No, we're not going to. We are going to get to talking about some football here, and we're going to start with quarterbacks. Arcathelza says, Adam, I thought you was still doing NBA this year. Are you doing anything for NBA like at all, or is it just?
I'm gonna do NBA tournament shows. I haven't started them yet. I'm still just kind of trying to deal with getting all of my NBA stuff in order, and obviously stuff just takes longer beginning of the year. So I haven't been in a position yet where I'm looking to take an hour out of my day to do a YouTube show, but I will be doing them sooner than later.
Nice. Yeah, it's tough, especially at the beginning of the year when you've got NFL going on still, and it's like getting used to all the new rotations, all the new teams. I don't know. And NBA just, to me, it's a whole different animal than NFL. It takes a lot. Like the learning curve is a lot tougher to prepare for NBA.
Yeah, exactly. Like I used to obviously just do it because I didn't have a choice and I was getting paid a lot to do it. But now it's more at, I'll do it when it makes sense for me. And at this point in the season, it doesn't make a ton of sense yet.
Take it at your own speed. All right. We are ready. We're going to talk through. We're going to start again at quarterback. So it's Aaron Rodgers, CJ Stroud tonight. At captain, we have Aaron Rodgers coming in at around 11% ownership. CJ Stroud coming in sub 5% on Roto Grinders. Are you seeing something similar, Adam, with these projected ownership? Because that sub 5 for CJ Stroud really stood out to me. I'm just going to reset the projections just in case anything's changed.
5 at captain?
Yeah, 5 at captain.
Yeah, I see like 4 to 5 at captain also.
Interesting. So apparently it is legit. And then in the flex, we have Aaron Rodgers coming in at 47.5%, CJ Stroud coming in at 31%. I don't know. Those numbers stand out to me for CJ Stroud. What are you seeing as far as what the Sims are giving you? How do you like that those numbers?
From a captain standpoint, I think both guys are pretty efficiently owned right now. CJ Stroud, for me, showing up optimal at captain right around 5% of the time. Rodgers showing up like 7.5% of the time. So I don't think there's really much edge either direction as far as captain ownership goes. I think it's pretty efficient. I do think both guys are going under owned at flex. Stroud more so than Rodgers. I have like a 34% flex ownership projection on Stroud. I think he's optimal about 40% of the time. Have about a 49% ownership projection on Rodgers. Think he's optimal about 52% of the time. So I think both quarterbacks look like good plays here, which generally, they're just going to. I think that there is, from an ownership or leverage standpoint, whatever you want to call it, a little bit more of an advantage to playing them at flex than captain, but I don't think that you're going wrong in either position. Obviously, CJ Stroud does get hurt by the fact that his receiving core, which was once a huge strength and a big reason to like the Texans offense, has now been decimated. You're down to Tank Dell and tight ends, essentially. So obviously that does have an impact on somebody like Stroud, especially when he's not somebody that gives you a ton of rushing upside.
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting. I see that number on Stroud and I really like it, but it also impacts him that all of his pass catchers are so much cheaper than him now. Like it's easier for him to be the captain if all of his pass catchers are more expensive. So it's an interesting spot. Togus wants says another fucking Jets game. Good. I mean, I agree. 100% agree with you on that sentiment. I'm so tired of the Jets, but we'll get through it. Both of these quarterbacks are pretty statuesque. So both of them, I would require at least one stacking partner. And I would require multiple if I have them in the captain spot. Breece Hall obviously qualifies as a pass catcher, 44 targets on the year. I don't think Joe Mixon, you could include Joe Mixon as one of your pass catchers if you want to. Adam, what are you seeing as far as how you're stacking them? I assume you're always stacking these quarterbacks. Are you multi-stacking when they're in the captain spot? Can you just look at some of your lineups, get an idea?
Yeah. So just from a player level standpoint, when Aaron Rodgers is captain, Garrett Wilson showing up 65% of the time, Davante Adams 63, then it drops off to Breece Hall at 46, then it drops off again to a bunch of guys in the like 25 to 33% range. So not surprisingly, Wilson and Adams showing up as the biggest priorities there. If I look at just like a set of optimal lineups that I created, when Aaron Rodgers is captain, I guess there's no easy way for me to see this still.
I thought you just read when Aaron Rodgers is that captain.
What'd you say?
I thought you just read off when
I read off individual players. I was trying to see like how often he was captain with receivers, but
gotcha.
I don't have an easy way of seeing that. I would assume that he's pretty often with two receivers. Like just scrolling through lineups, Rodgers, Hall, Adams, Wilson. Obviously nothing wrong with that. Just this one has it has Breece Hall, so that's Breece Hall and Jeremy Ruckert. Those I guess technically both count. Hall, Wilson, Conklin. Yeah, so you're pairing him with multiple guys pretty often, which I would expect. CJ Stroud on the other side. I think, from he doesn't run a lot standpoint, it would make sense to double stack him, but he does obviously just have weaker receivers in general. So whereas like Aaron Rodgers at captain was showing up with Wilson and Adams at flex 60+% of the time, Tank Dell leading the way at flex with CJ Stroud only 50% of the time. Joe Mixon, 46%, Robert Woods and John Metchie, each about 43%, Schultz around 40. So they are pulled back a little bit. And that would make me think that you still obviously can stack him twice, but I think you do have a little bit easier path with the Texans to potentially one pass catcher just having a far and away, best game where like it's just Stroud plus Dell and nobody else is great, or it's Stroud plus Metchie and nobody else is great, whatever it may be. So while you still can double stack him, clearly, I do think that there is a little bit easier path maybe to just like stacking him with one receiver plus Mixon obviously would make a lot of sense as well.
Yep, that could work. It's a difficult dynamic where it's like, well, as pass catchers, like maybe they could have like a 3-man rotation for that wide receiver 2 and 3 role, and maybe they all just like get some work between Metchie, Woods, Hutchinson, and maybe they work in tight ends more. So could be super spread out, but then they're all also really cheap. So it's like, well, one of them a little bit more likely to get there relative to salary.
One thing to keep in mind there too, and Cody Main tweeted it out. I think it was him. 99% sure.
Probably
the other day, talking about the differences in DraftKings salary this year compared to previous seasons. And that is really important to keep in mind. Like, it's not something that you have to keep in mind if you're using, Optos and Sims and all of that, because it'll just naturally work itself out. But when we're talking about these games, it is important when you're trying to contextualize stuff because, and I know I've done it a lot this year, there's still that tendency to just be like, oh, well, this guy's $600. If he gets 8 points, he's optimal. Whereas because the most expensive players this year aren't as expensive as they have been in the past, you do run into that situation where raw points just matter a little bit more for your value guys. So it's not as simple as saying, John Metchie is 2,800. If he scores a touchdown and gets 30 yards and has, 9.5 points, he's definitely optimal. Like, he could still very easily just not be optimal because you don't necessarily have to pay down that far because pricing is softer.
Yeah, exactly. You need to always factor in the slate specifics, like the context of the entire slate. It's
It
also
also,
interesting.
and
Go ahead.
this, I'm kind of just thinking through it as we talk about it, but Tim D had just mentioned kickers have gotten way too good the past couple of years. The pricing thing also makes kickers more valuable because if your top end guys, like let's say Joe Mixon was 12K today, Brees Hall is 11.5, Rodgers and Stroud are 10.5, and then you have your kickers coming in at 5,200 for Fairbarn, 4,800 for whoever ends up kicking for the Jets. If those guys at the top are your best skill players are more expensive, then it's harder to get to that 5K range, and it makes the $2,800 guy more valuable. But it's very, very easy to play the best skill players and the 5K guy, and kickers just end up being used more when they score 10 points and beat the 2,800 guy. So like the kickers are making long field goals more, which is true, but also the pricing at the top is what's driving kickers being optimal more also.
Yeah, they end up in the winning lineups more often. It also like so just like my general rule of like, well, if a quarterback is going to be optimal at captain, they're usually going to be if they're not a running quarterback, it's usually going to be multiple pass catchers. There would be a point where it's like if a quarterback was, I mean, just using the most extreme examples, if your quarterback is 200, well, then that wouldn't be the case necessarily because they don't need to be the highest scoring. Like that whole concept revolves around like they're usually like the most expensive on the slate. So if you assume they are the most expensive, then for them to be optimal, they need to really go off. The cheaper quarterbacks are relative to their skill position players. It becomes less and less of that dynamic of you need to be double stacking your quarterback if they are captain. I don't know if they're cheap enough yet where I'm like coming off of that, but it is something that I'm factoring. Is like, man, if quarterbacks keep getting cheaper, and it feels like they keep getting cheaper this year, like down to like 9,000 as opposed to 11,000 years past.
Yeah, I
that
think
also is
that's
going to.
yeah. No, so I think that's related to pretty much all season long. I've kind of just been looking on these shows. I thought that quarterbacks, for the most part, there have been a couple exceptions, are either correctly owned or under owned, and it does have to do with their prices coming down, where it just becomes a raw points game. Where even if the quarterback isn't great, they still are going to have a higher median projection than most players, and they just become so easy to get into lineups that like you're saying, the cheaper they become, obviously the less that they have to do, which means that it's less necessary to be stacking them aggressively, and you start to just get to a point where it's kind of like pitchers in Baseball Showdown. A guy can pitch poorly, score 8 points, and he's going to beat almost every hitter on the slate. It starts to kind of be the same thing in NFL.
Yeah, and we just saw it. We've seen quarterbacks get in there with like 13 to 15 fantasy points. I think we had, I think Russell Wilson maybe got up to 15 in this the most recent game on Monday. It gets in there with just one pass catcher, and yeah, you see it. It definitely changes things the way the salaries have moved. Anything else on? I guess we can look at schedule adjusted for quarterbacks before we move on to wide receivers. And here's the schedule adjusted page. I'm just going to go to my article instead of counting it off now because I already have it. Jets defense has allowed the 8th fewest schedule adjusted fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, so kind of a tough matchup for CJ Stroud. Texans defense has allowed the 11th most schedule adjusted fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. That one sort of surprised me that the Jets defense, the Texans defense has been a sort of positive matchup so far this year for quarterbacks. Because when you look at like the, just raw passing yards per game, they're like top of the league in terms of stopping the pass. But I think it comes down to they've allowed many passing touchdowns. So I don't really know how much I want to read into that. That seems kind of fluky that like the Texans defense has like it's a good schedule adjusted matchup, but it's mostly because they've allowed a lot of touchdowns, which seems flukier to me than yardage. But there's still something to it. So worth noting that it is sort of like slightly above average matchup. It's basically neutral for Aaron Rodgers, tough matchup for CJ Stroud.
Yeah. Also, most of that Houston being above average has been created on the ground, which is not going to be happening tonight.
Right. All right. Yeah, good point. The let's see. Yeah, good point. Okay. We'll move on and talk about running backs here. I just had to double check you for some reason because I was like, man, I didn't even notice that, but yeah, it's a slightly more. Running backs, Breece Hall, Joe Mixon at the top. Joe Mixon's usage this season has just been absolutely insane. Probably going to continue tonight. He has the highest projection on the entire slate. Going to get a lot of ownership as a result. So he's 11,000. At captain, we have Joe Mixon coming in at 17% projected ownership. At flex, Joe Mixon coming in at 40% projected ownership. Well, no, I just read off Breece Hall. I'm 40%. No, never mind. I did. Okay, good. I am, as you can tell, it's still the morning. I have not been up long, and I'm still a little bit foggy here. Joe Mixon getting a lot of ownership despite being very expensive. How do you feel about it, Adam?
Yeah, this is one of those spots that I hate talking about because he is the highest projected guy on the slate. Obviously, he looks really, really good. He has a very good chance of being optimal. I think he has the highest optimal captain percentage on the slate at like 22% for me right now. I also think he's overowned in both the captain and flex spots, much more so at flex than at captain. I only have him slightly overowned at captain. I have him very overowned at flex. But I think it's a salary thing. Like, obviously, the workload for Mixon has been greit. He had a season high in route participation last week. He had a season high 16% target share. So he's trending in the right direction there. He handled 86% of their rushing attempts. Dameon Pierce is still out, so you don't even really have a backup there in terms of, on the ground at least. So all of that looks great, but it's still a tough matchup. It's still a very expensive price tag. And then one other thing I think that to kind of keep in mind here is when you're going to Joe Mixon at this 11K price tag, that is going to force you into obviously finding some value plays. The most obvious value plays are in the Houston passing game, I think, where you have, Metchie at 2,800, you have Hutchinson at 4K, etc. The better that those guys do, the more, the better that CJ Stroud is probably doing. And so, like, you're kind of walking this line, which can very easily hit. It's not like it's, a huge thing, but I think it is kind of driving this a little bit, is the better that the value guys that you're most likely to have with Joe Mixon do, the more likely it is that CJ Stroud is keeping up with Joe Mixon at a cheaper price tag and kind of pulling down his optimal percentage as well.
True. Yeah, I'm struggling with Joe Mixon, and again, I do the expert survey, so then I'm asked the question like, who are you going to be most underweight on relative to the field, and I hate doing it like the night before because I have to like think about who do I think I'm going to be, and it'll change throughout the day. And Joe Mixon was my answer though for the player that I think I'm going to be the most underweight on relative to the field. And I'm a little bit hesitant because so my reasoning is not super involved in the passing game so far this year. Andy's 11,000. Andy has a terrible matchup. So it just feels like, even with the workload he has, like it's very easy to fail at 11,000 if he just doesn't get into the end zone twice. If he's not involved in the passing game, it's going to be tough for him to get there. And obviously doesn't get to the 100-yard bonus. And it's going to be tougher against the Jets. But also he's just extremely involved in this. Like he's going to have so many opportunities in any given game. And on top of that, like you said, he had his pretty reasonable target share last week, and you would kind of expect that to maybe continue with both Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs out. Like he might be a little bit more involved in the passing game, in which case suddenly it doesn't look like as good of a bet. Like I'd love it if he's only going to get 4 targets in the game. Like just the fade makes sense to me, but he might be more involved in the passing game. We know that he can be. Like you look at his past years, he has seasoned with 60 catches, 50 catches the past couple of years. Like so that just the fact that they haven't been using him that much. Like he's a decent pass catcher. I don't know. So it's a tough. I still think as of right now, I'm probably going to be light on Joe Mixon overall. But it scares me a little bit.
Yeah, I'm interested to see where I end up in terms of my actual lineups because again, one single player, player level leverage ownership isn't the end all be all. But I do think he's going under or over owned, especially at flex. I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up being like my highest owned captain. But then I just don't have a lot of non-captain Mixon lineups. As far as his pass game work too, another positive here is, and you would expect to see it, but it's worth pointing out, Dare Ogunbowale in the first 2 games of the season had a 21 and 26% route participation. Those are the 2 games that Mixon played. Then Mixon misses 3 games. Obviously, Ogunbowale has a bigger role. In the 3 games since Mixon came back, Ogunbowale's highest route participation is 17%. So, you have seen the guy that would steal the pass catching work kind of really fall off at the same time, as Mixon's getting a bigger workload. So, you've seen it 3 weeks in a row now where he's really run a lot more routes than Ogunbowale has.
Yeah. Stephen Leibowitz says, Rhamondre Stevenson did not have a great rushing game versus the Jets, but like Mixon gets big red zone work. So Mixon can, he can still, like clearly Mixon can get there. He can get there in any matchup. But overall, I think as of right now, probably a fade for me, not like a full fade, but like I think I said in the expert survey, I'm going to cap him at 25% in the flex, which is kind of scary. I'll be way under the field if I do that. But trying to find ways to get a little bit different that I think could make sense. And I think he's just so expensive that if he does not see an increase in his passing work, then I think it's going to be tough for him to get there. Like he could score a touchdown and still not get there at 11,000. Like I don't know. It's just such a hefty price tag. And
Yeah,
he's
and I mean,
getting
there's
so much
like
ownership.
he is the highest projected guy on the slate. Like we know that it's accounted for that he's getting the goal line work and that he is the clear workhorse in this offense. So it's not that stuff's accounted for. It's really a price thing. And just to kind of put it all in context, talking about flex specifically, where Mixon is projected to be the highest owned guy at around 50%. I have his chances of being optimal in the flex as very good, but in the same bucket as Breece Hall, CJ Stroud, Garrett Wilson, Davante Adams, Tank Dell, all 30 to 40%. So kind of in that same range with those guys. And obviously that is factoring in salary. Salary agnostic Mixon would be higher because he projects better. But those guys are all, similar, and you're getting on most of the guys like 30 to 40% ownership instead of the 50% coming into Mixon. So it's not even like when you are just viewing it on a player level, which again isn't the perfect way to approach it, but from like a player level, it's not even like if you say, well, I'm not going to play as much Mixon and flex, you have to go to, names that you really don't want to get to. You're still getting to very, very good players.
Right. Yeah, exactly. There are so many different like star level players in this game that you don't need to get there. I don't know. It's tough to know exactly what we want to do at this time in the morning. Hopefully we'll get, I don't know, some more chatter about the wide receiver rooms and be able to make some other choices. But it's tough. It's a tough fade for sure.
Yeah. Right now. So like the big thing for me, whenever you talk about like player level fades, for lack of a better word, is you have to have like some sort of answer for who you go to instead that looks good. That's you'll see it, you'll get it a lot on any show where people in chat are just like, oh, fade so and so, he's X% owned. Okay, well, what's your alternative that is just as good? Here, when I'm just looking at individual flex optimals versus ownership, I have Mixon and Breece Hall both going really over owned in flex, but that means Aaron Rodgers, CJ Stroud, Garrett Wilson, Davante Adams, Tank Dell, and some other lesser guys are all showing up as under-owned. But I just highlighting the Rodgers, Stroud, Wilson, Adams, Dell part again, like you have this whole group of very, very good players that are likely to succeed that I think are going under-owned as a result of how much ownership Mixon is expected to get. So it really can't be emphasized enough that when you do look at it from a player level, it is nice when those are the guys that you're like, oh, well, I would just play more of them, as opposed to being like, oh, well, I think that the defense is going on their own, so I'm going to play them instead of Joe Mixon. Like that's kind of a shitty spot to be in. But you're getting legitimate high upside, very good players that are losing ownership to Joe Mixon when they probably shouldn't.
Yeah, exactly right.
Mixon is a better running back than he showed in Cincinnati. He was in Cincinnati his entire career. I think he's probably exactly the running back he showed in Cincinnati.
Yeah, he is in a better spot now than he was. Like his usage has been insane, and he has looked really good. But he was just this good in Cincinnati, just wasn't in as good of a spot. Yeah, good to see Brandon Katz back here telling us that our takes are dumb. I mean, what is he even disagreeing with here? That's a dumb take. Mixon is Houston's best runner and receiver. I mean, I don't think he's probably their best receiver. He is their best runner. Clearly, nobody's disagreeing with that. I don't know. I don't know what to tell you, Brandon. Okay. Breece Hall. Actually, no. Let's finish the Texans. We'd like to go team by team here. So Dare Ogunbowale, I think, is the only other. JJ Taylor, interesting. Dare Ogunbowale at 2,000 is pretty like. He's interesting in that he has almost zero standalone value, but I think has the most contingent value. I don't know. How do you see this Texans backfield? Do you have any interest in playing anybody outside of Joe Mixon? How many lineups would it take you before you think you get to one?
Yeah, I mean, not a ton. Like Ogunbowale is getting about 7% ownership in flex. I have him optimal like 8% of the time. But we just mentioned it. Like his workload's actually been disappearing as well as we're seeing Mixon run more routes. Ogunbowale is never, your early down rushing back. And to your point about contingent value, obviously, if Mixon were to get hurt, Ogunbowale plays a bigger role. But I do think that you would see like a split. I don't think you're going to see Ogunbowale just take over all the carries. You're not going to get like the Isaac. You wouldn't expect to get like the Isaac Garendo game where Mason gets hurt and Garendo is just the guy. You're not expecting that with Ogunbowale. You would just see things spread out in the backfield where clearly it's a benefit, but it's not even like a lock that he becomes an optimal play in that situation. So he's 2K. If he ends up in some lineups, fine. I don't think he's like a 0 or anything like that. JJ Taylor, 200. I think he's the guy probably that, like, if Mixon gets hurt, like, you need to have him at only 200 probably. But clearly not going to play a big role if nobody gets hurt. So not much interest in either guy here. Agumbawale would be the preferred one, just because at least most of his time on the field is going to be running routes, even if it's at a reduced rate to what we saw earlier in the year.
It's even Jada Taylor might not even be active tonight, so we'll keep an eye on that. In that case, then that would obviously make you like Agumbawale better. I will say that the one reason to potentially like Agumbawale is the one game Joe Mixon missed. He did have 15 carries, so in that game at least they did use him as like a pseudo bell cow. So, but it's like entirely contingent value. Like they're just not going to give him much of a workload in a regular game script if there's no blowout and no injury to Joe Mixon. He just, as you said, just hasn't had much usage, particularly in recent weeks. So tough to get there unless you want to make the bet on an injury or something like that. In which case, I mean, sometimes I'll say I would play both, and honestly, it's probably fine because Joe Mixon could put up like 17 points and a half and then get hurt. But it's not my favorite spot to play both running backs together, because I feel like Agumbawale, because it is so much like only contingent value, it's going to be tough to play them together. Can you see if you're getting them together at all?
Yeah, I can look. I'll say the if you needed like a bull case for playing them together, I think it would be that most of Agumbawale's, assuming Mixon stays healthy, most of Agumbawale's value is in the passing game. So like he can catch a few passes, one of them ends up being a touchdown. That's not having a huge impact on Mixon's game. It's not like he's not, Agumbawale isn't getting his value by just taking 15 carries away from Joe Mixon or something. Like,
right.
He can just get there through the passing game, which doesn't detract too much from Mixon. In lineups where Mixon is captain, Agumbawale is showing up as optimal in actually I can just look this way. Like 13% of the time, which is, I'm sure, just a price thing. Kind of like I was talking about.
Yeah.
It's just the lineups where Agumbawale catches enough passes that at $2,000, he helps you pay off Mixon. Maybe he gets a little bit more passing game work because of the injuries. Kind of doubt it, but good, I guess. In lineups where I have Mixon at flex, Agumbawale is showing up about 10% of the time, so a little bit lower, which makes sense just because Mixon at flex is saving you a little bit of money versus Mixon at captain.
No, I mean, it's interesting to see that you are getting it because SaberSim does like the game by game sim. So they are accounting for like, can they both get there together? And seems like they're showing that they can. And, to Brandon Katz is, not the worst point that Brandon Katz has made. I think this might be true. that team's limit, the starting running backs on, I don't know if it's true for sure, but would theoretically make sense that backup running backs would have more value. So maybe it's possible Agumbawale also has a little bit more standalone value on a Thursday game than he would on most. They haven't shown any, like, none of the coach week has suggested that they want to do anything other than just give Mixon the ball 25 times a game. So I don't know if that's true. Yeah. But
one other thing too to keep in mind, just talking about optimal percentages on Showdown, especially, you are walking the line too, because like the true percentage is probably lower than 13 and 10%, because it's not accounting very well for like this lineup. Like in sim number 1, this lineup is optimal. It won't show up as optimal again in the rates that I'm looking at. So like it's going to inflate just because it needs to give me X number of lineups that I told it to give me. It's going to like inflate the bottom end and kind of reduce the top end, when like realistically the Mixon without Agumbawale lineup might be optimal 5 times to every 1 time that the Mixon Agumbawale lineup is optimal, if that makes sense. So just whenever, it's a very loose like optimal percentage, and you are kind of going to see it skewed that way.
Yeah. Nadu says, so I gave the example of potentially, Mixon could pay off his salary with like 11 points and a half. I mean, yeah, there's a good, like, that's the reason that I'm lightly fading Joe Mixon is it's going to be tough for him. If he gets to 17 fantasy points, he's a little bit less likely to be optimal at 11K, but I think like it's possible. Like Joe Mixon is, he gets so much usage that he could have, again, a touchdown and several, couple catches, many yards, and get to 17 points. And that might be enough depending on how the game goes. So yeah, not the likeliest scenario for sure. TDI, TTID forever. You should go back and the beginning of the show, we talked about this a little bit. At some point, Adam will be doing some NBA content on his channel.
Yeah, I'll be doing it sooner than later. I just need to get on a schedule, and I've had some other stuff going on and haven't had time to commit to that. I'm trying to not like do it and then take 4 days off from it and do it again. Like I'm trying to wait until I'm confident that I can just like do it most days, which probably will be in the next like week or two.
Nice. All right. And JJ Taylor's how much JJ Taylor? I hadn't even thought about JJ Taylor. Let's see, what is he coming in at here?
Basically none.
Yeah, he's projected for a fantasy point, about 4% ownership. Seems similar to Ogunbowale. I think Ogunbowale a little bit more likely to be the guy if Joe Mixon got hurt, but also more expensive. I don't know. Both seem like they're contingent value only, and not getting much ownership. So you can mix them in, but there's no like real like reason based on usage in the past to think like, oh, they're going to be better. I don't know. It's basically all contingent value for either of them, and not entirely true. Oh, okay. What he said is true because he has this one sample. One sample. Okay. All right. Breece Hall, second best projected running back on the slate. 44 targets on the year, if I remember correctly. Just pretty nice usage there for the Jets. At captain, we have Breece Hall coming in at 16% ownership. At flex, we have Breece Hall coming in at 42.5% ownership. You said, I think you already said that you think Breece Hall is going a little bit over owned in the flex in particular.
Yeah, I think you can kind of just like replay everything I said about Joe Mixon, and it applies to Breece Hall as well from ownership standpoint. Captain leverage, I think he's going a little bit over owned. Flex, I think he's going a lot over owned. It has to do with the salary. Like he's the second most expensive player on the slate. You do have Braylon Allen, where at least with Joe Mixon, it would be very, very surprising if they get to the goal line and like Daria Ogunbowale steals a goal line carry. It's not surprising at all if Braylon Allen is stealing goal line carries from Breece Hall. You have a good backup running back in Allen, and Hall hasn't been a particularly good runner so far this year. He hasn't shown the same level of explosiveness. So clearly he's still the main guy. He's had an 80+% market share each of the last 2 weeks. Allen's been around 15%, but there's no like game to game guarantee that Braylon Allen doesn't just get hot and start taking carries away from Hall. So you do have a little bit more downside risk on Hall's usage, even though the most likely outcome is that he is the clear number one, just because of Braylon Allen existing. He is a little bit cheaper, so you are getting a discount for that. He is still, the one of the highest owned optimal flex plays for me. He is the second highest optimal captain for me behind Mixon, but the ownership is just there, and I think that there's other ways you can go using very good players that just don't happen to be Breece Hall.
Yeah, it's like I feel like I like him just a little bit better than Mixon because of the passing game work. I mean, just elite passing game work for Breece Hall in general. I think it's like 40, like I said, 44 targets on the year. And he's a little bit cheaper. So yeah, he has a couple things going for him that make it a little bit tougher to get to Joe Mixon. The lower price tag and the passing game work obviously really strong there for Breece Hall, but also like he does not have the guaranteed workload that Joe Mixon does, where Joe Mixon is just consistently getting a million touches every single game. It's a little bit, I don't know. There's a couple differences there in that Hall does not have quite the same usage, but then he gets usage in the passing game. So it's also like game script independent for Hall. Maybe that's the case for Mixon too. I don't know. It's a different scenario because you have the risk of Braylon Allen coming in, and that kind of happened out of nowhere last week. Like it's kind of seemed like Braylon Allen was kind of fading away. Two carries in week 7, in week 6, just another 2 carries, just had not been super involved, and then seemingly out of nowhere, Braylon Allen comes in. Also interesting to note that Braylon Allen had like 4 first downs last week, if I'm remembering correctly. Let's see.
And I misspoke. I had the wrong column up. 80+% market share for Hall week 7 and week 6, 57 last week, 43 Allen. So to your point, and to the point that I was kind of making, like you can see even when Breece Hall, in a lot of games is dominating, like in any given game, you can just have Braylon Allen getting hot, taking more carries. Now, obviously, you are coming off of last week where Allen played a bigger role. That doesn't mean that it's going to carry over to this week. But obviously, it could. It's a risk that's just always going to be there.
I just realized that I'm on the wrong page to look at. But I mean, ultimately, just making the point that Braylon Allen, like you kind of alluded to, like he is the type of running back that you would expect to get goal line carries, and he got one of the two inside the 5 carries. He got a carry from the one, converted it for a touchdown, where they may have confused somebody's elbow for a football. But regardless, he is big-bodied rookie running back, and he seems like he should be the goal line back, so he might take on more and more of that role. 12.5% inside the 5 carries so far this year. I should have had this separated by week, but I think he had four first downs and a touchdown last week, so it was good in that role. It's funny because I played a lot of Breece Hall last week, and I was super frustrated because Braylon Allen was getting work, while at the time it was like Breece Hall is like averaging 8 yards per carry, Braylon Allen's 2 yards per carry, but ultimately he has been pretty efficient so far this year. Let's see. Okay, just 2 first downs. Is this separated by week? No. Okay, now separated by week. Yeah, four first downs last week for Braylon Allen. Also converted his one inside the 5 rush for a touchdown. So nice week for him. Seems like he could continue to have more work as a result. Yeah, I don't know. It's a tough situation. What are you doing with Braylon Allen? So you think Breece Hall is a little bit over-owned? I mean, obviously the 12 carries last week, pretty promising for Allen. I don't know. What are you doing there?
I think Fields pretty much got it right. Like 17% flex ownership. I have him at about 14% flex optimal, so a little bit over-owned there. Captain, like spot on 1.5% ownership, 1.5% chance of being optimal. I think he's kind of just a guy. There is there's a lot of input volatility here in addition to obviously his production volatility, because his workload can range pretty much anywhere from like 10% of the carries to 50%, and he can get goal line carries or he cannot. So like there's huge volatility there, but that's also going to be factored into the ownership because everybody's aware of it. It's not like, this is a spot where Braylon Allen hasn't been involved all season long and I'm sitting here saying, hey, I think this is the week he could get involved. Like everybody's very aware that he can be involved. If he was consistently every week getting that 10 to 15%, he would be 10% on here instead of 17.
Yeah, exactly. He's a better bet than Agumbawale in that he has standalone value, but also it varies a ton week to week. Sort of interesting. Captain ownership at just 1.5%. I don't hate it. I don't know that I really love it, but might try and get over that if I were doing 150. Where do you have the ownership at? RG has him at 15% in the flex.
I have it 17, so same ballpark.
Okay, yeah, seems about right. Yeah, seems like a strong enough play. Okay,
we now have Brandon Katz completely dialed in on his take that starting running backs and backup running backs, neither one get bigger workloads on Thursdays.
What you don't understand, Adam, is that teams don't want to play their players on Thursdays.
Right, yes. Which is true.
You can't play
unfortunately, the NFL makes them.
Yeah, they are forced. Would you play Breece Hall and Braylon Allen in the same lineup?
I don't have a problem with it just because it's Showdown. I think that in some ways it works better than Mixon Agumbawale, in other ways it doesn't. The Mixon Agumbawale, obviously I gave the example of like Agumbawale being cheaper than Allen and maybe just catching a few passes, which doesn't really impact Mixon's workload. With Allen being 4,400, clearly the easiest way for him to get there is to break off a couple big runs and get into the end zone. And if he ends up stealing a touchdown or two from Hall, that does clearly limit Hall's ability to pay off that price tag with how expensive he is. So in that regard, they don't really work that well together. But on the other hand, they are both good. You could get a game where Hall scores twice, Allen scores once, Allen has 50 yards, Hall has like 100. Like that obviously can happen. So one game slate, I think it's fine. As usual, it's not my favorite strategy, but people also do it less. So you get that ownership trade-off or Duke trade-off in addition, or in exchange for giving up some projection. Yeah.
Obviously more expensive as a tandem with Breece Hall and Braylon Allen than the Joe Mixon Dare Agumbawale one. But yeah, I think that they seem reasonable to play together, again, with the hope that they just run all over the Texans, which, this isn't really the game for it, where neither of the defenses is bad against the run, but theoretically could happen. Looking at schedule adjusted stuff for running backs, and again, I'm just going to go back and look.
Did they even have Thursday Night Football when Eddie George played? Why is he citing Eddie George?
He's the best. The Jets defense has allowed the 10th fewest schedule adjusted fantasy points per game to running backs. Texans defense the 4th fewest. So tough spots for both of the running games. Brandon says I didn't say that about backup running backs. Did we misrepresent what you say and make a straw man argument? I mean, welcome to the Brandon Katz experience, Brandon Katz, if that is the case.
I mean, he said that they don't want to. He said the agents of running backs that don't have big contracts don't want their guys to play on Thursday night. Most backup running backs don't have big contracts.
Yeah. Okay. It's just,
and also, one last point there: the teams absolutely want to run those guys into the ground because they're not paying them. They do not care what the agents want.
Yeah, they don't care at all. Teams do not care what the agent wants. Yes, exactly. All right. Nottingham says, where are these messages even? You must be, or Brandon must be in your chat, I'm guessing. And then
I'm just seeing it
vice versa
in StreamYard.
Yeah. So Nottingham, we are streaming to both the Flannelverse and Endgame Syndicate YouTube channels, and in StreamYard you can see all the comments for both of those, and we're also streaming to both of our Twitters, so we can see anything from Twitter comments
as well.
So
now,
yeah. We got the question, how is basketball going for Adam and Neil? Not horribly. Last night was actually my worst by far, which is funny because I was on all the good chalk, but
so was everybody.
Yeah, everybody was on the good chalk and just did not get there with all the other pieces you needed. How's basketball going for you?
I think I'm up some. The last few days sucked. Yesterday was bad. I had a 10K second place on Sunday, so that's obviously carrying me so far. I had like a 13th the day before, or 2 days before that in the lotto, so came close and then got second. So I haven't looked. I would guess I'm like up some.
I'm definitely down on the season, but it's been like I'm losing 5% of what I play most nights, which is like, if I can do that until I have a winning night, then I'll take that all day, like usually. But last night was the first night that it was like I lost most of what I put in. Just a tough night, even though like I felt like the players I was on did really well. It just didn't work out in terms of my lineups.
Yesterday and I think maybe the day before were the first couple days where like I got smoked in NBA. It had been pretty much the same thing so far. It was like, oh, I lost like 5%. That's fine. And then it's like, oh, I won big. And then it's like, oh, I lost 5%. That's fine. I hope this happens all season. And then finally took a bath the last couple of nights.
Yep. That was a tough one. Isaiah Davis, I don't think I'm going to get to. Let's see, last week, 0 snaps, 1 snap the week prior to that. I think it's just a little bit too thin. I guess similar to JJ Taylor. I don't know. Do you see any difference there?
Nope.
Okay. Let's move on.
I mean, so Isaiah Davis is actually showing up less for me than JJ Taylor. I think the difference is just Braylon Allen versus Dare Ogunbowale as your number 2.
Good point. Yeah. Good point. Okay. Because Ogunbowale, like JJ Taylor might be playing ahead of Ogunbowale, whereas there's no chance Isaiah Davis is going to get more work or very, like, I can't see it happening where he gets more work than Braylon Allen. So yeah, a little bit of difference.
Like there. It's not happening with JJ Taylor either, probably, but if after this game it's like, oh wow, JJ Taylor had a couple of carries that we didn't expect and Ogunbowale didn't get any, like nobody's going to be shocked. If it's like, oh, Isaiah Davis played ahead of Braylon Allen, like, something very weird happened.
Yep. Refreshing this, we're going to go to wide receivers. So we'll start with the Jets. So obviously Davante Adams has been there for 2 weeks. Still, I think, so far it's been Garrett Wilson has had like 17 targets to Davante Adams is 12. I don't really want to read that much into what has happened in a 2-game sample size. But I think around the industry, Garrett Wilson being projected better than Davante Adams everywhere. I think, let's see, Davante Adams here, 15, Garrett Wilson, 15.5. I mean, not by a ton, but slightly higher projection there on Garrett Wilson. Actually looking like he's coming in lower owned here at RG in the flex. Garrett Wilson, 35.5%, Davante Adams, 36%. At captain, we have Garrett Wilson coming in at 9%, Davante Adams, 8%. It is worth noting, sadly, that Alden Lazard is out once again. So that's something you can factor in. He was out last week, though, as well. What are you doing? Do you have any strong preference between Davante Adams and Garrett Wilson? How are you playing them relative to the field?
Yeah, I like them both. Identical route participation last week. Clearly, these two are going to dominate routes run. They should dominate targets. You had, I think, a 28% target share for Wilson last week to 21 for Adams. That's going to just bounce around week over week. Obviously, Adams is going to have plenty of weeks where he gets the bulk of the targets as well. I mentioned it before, though. I think that at captain, I think the ownership is pretty much where it should be. I don't think there's really an edge one way or the other. They both look fine. They're both projected for, or Wilson's projected for about 9% captain ownership. Adams is around 7. That's where I have their optimal rates as well. I think the advantage is playing them in flex. They're two of the most under-owned flex guys in my data right now. Wilson coming in at 9,600, Adams at 9,800, 32 to 34% ownership on both. I have their optimal flex percentage at like 35 to 38%. So they are two guys that I like getting to in flex a bit more than the field. And then a captain, I think they look perfectly fine as well. You do expect pretty concentrated targets to these guys. Mike Williams obviously plays a bigger role without Lazard, but he hasn't been somebody that's gotten Rodgers' trust or gotten a lot of targets from him this year. Clearly, he trusts Adams. Obviously, Wilson's really good. So, expect those guys to both be heavily involved, and also you get a lot of touchdown equity. Davante Adams has made a career out of stealing 2-yard touchdowns from his running back, so that exists as well.
Yeah, I like them both quite a bit. I think that I'm going to end up just narrative based. I think I'm going to lean in on Davante Adams a little bit more here, but it's not for any good reason that you should tell me on. Just the game is in New York. I don't know. I kind of feel like there's something like Rodgers still wants to prove it, like that it was a good trade to get his guy Davante Adams. But that is entirely narrative based. No real separation for me between the two. They both look like strong plays to me at relatively low ownership.
Yeah, if you were to, if by lock for some reason, like if you think that one of these guys is getting significantly more ownership than the other one, I would just play the other one aggressively. Yeah, exactly. But I think the field's pretty much got it right here. Like they're being projected similarly in terms of actual projection, in terms of ownership projection. So I think it's more so just like as a group, at least with the way ownership looks right now, I want more of them than the field collectively. I don't have a big preference in either one. I think they're essentially the same play.
Yep. Texans defense has allowed the 10th most schedule adjusted fantasy points per game to wide receivers. So it has been a good spot for wide receivers. I think mostly just due to they've allowed a lot of touchdowns to wide receivers. So that's sort of interesting. And just looking at the, wide receiver cornerback matchups. Where are they? Jets. Slightly negative matchup, but like just barely slightly for all three: Davante Adams, Mike Williams, Garrett Wilson. Nobody really standing up from that perspective. Interestingly, Garrett Wilson showing up as having the big advantage in his matchup, which might just be like he's done better this year in terms of yards per route run and stuff. Whereas Davante Adams, I've seen some indications that some people think that Davante Adams might be kind of fallen off a little bit, whereas Garrett Wilson clearly in the prime of his career. I don't know. I'm not reading too much into that kind of stuff yet, but interesting that the cornerback matchup thinks that Garrett Wilson has the advantage more in his matchup than Davante Adams does. Which probably better to like lean on that kind of data point rather than my narrative take. But I still think I probably end up with a little bit higher on Davante Adams, but I think that they're, like you said, just kind of the exact same play. And Mike Williams, last week he had 62%. Here, let me pull up. I want to say 62% route participation last week, but saw 0 targets with Lazard out. What are you doing with Mike Williams? Let's see. Ownership coming in the flex at 15% projected ownership. For Mike Williams, yeah.
Where is he? Yeah, he's another one that I think for a lot of these cheaper guys, the field's pretty much efficient from an ownership standpoint. I have him optimal in the flex 13% of the time, optimal at captain 1%. Field's ownership is pretty much in that same ballpark. It clearly does play a bigger role without Lazard, but also not stepping into the Lazard role as far as being extremely trusted by Aaron Rodgers and getting targets over people better than him. So more routes obviously means more opportunities. 62% route participation last week is very good. It was 27.5 the week before that. So he's going to be on the field more. He is cheap. He still just isn't earning targets. His highest target share of the entire season was 11.9% in week 4. Obviously, adding Davante Adams here is not doing him any favors. If you think about it, kind of, like he's stepping into a bigger role now because of Lazard being out. But prior to the Adams trade, he had this role with Wilson, Lazard ahead of him. I would rather be behind Wilson, Lazard than behind Wilson, Adams.
Yep, agreed. Tough spot here. Yeah, we did. Good to see that he is getting the more route participation. I don't know, 15% feels about right to me in terms of ownership. I think that is a reasonable number. Where do you have the projected ownership at? And
14.
Okay, and you're about neutral with the field?
Yep.
Okay. All right. And anybody else you get into any Xavier Gibson up to 14% route participation? You would think at some point maybe they would go like a different direction if they just really don't trust Mike Williams, but they haven't really shown any inclination to do so. I don't know. Gibson seems like just your typical, like, he'll probably play a few snaps, maybe score the touchdown.
And I mean, they could now. Like, I think Adams being there does make it easier if they want to just get away from Williams, because the way they've been doing it right now is they're kind of just rotating all of these guys through the slot: Wilson, Adams, Williams. But you could just say, okay, Gibson's now our slot guy. Wilson's going to play outside. Adams is going to play outside. So, they could go that route. They could have done that with Lazard too. They didn't. So for now, I assume that you just continue to see what we've seen previously, where Gibson is clearly the fourth guy. Ran routes about 14% of the time last week, but that could change at any point. As is right now, though, I think that he's basically just a cheap guy that, he's in that bucket where he's like 3% optimal, 3-4% owned. Tough to really make a strong case for him right now. Even though he got in the end zone last week, his workload didn't really suggest big games to come.
Right. Okay. On the other side, Tank Dell. So now we have Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs both out. Tank Dell should come on as the clear number one receiver for the Texans. He's 9,200 coming in the flex at, 32% ownership. In the captain spot, Tank Dell coming in at 8% ownership. Seems I kind of like this 8% number, I think, in the captain spot for Tank Dell, just under the assumption that he might be peppered with targets, even though they haven't really showed it so far this year. I don't know. How do you feel about 40% total ownership? Where do you think you're playing Dell the most?
Yeah, I think everything looks pretty much right on him. 30% projected ownership, 7.5% captain. That's pretty much in line with optimal percentages for him. It's kind of a two-way street here. Like, obviously, the ceiling is higher when you don't have Nico Collins and you don't have Stephon Diggs, because there's no bona fide NFL receivers taking theoretical targets away from Tank Dell. The negative is you can't just throw a bunch of usage at him, because the Jets are very aware of who they're playing against, and that Tank Dell is the guy that they need to take away. Also, Tank Dell just hasn't been very good this year. Very, very good at getting separation last year, had a big year. Now this year, he has been plagued by drops. Stroud has just missed some open throws to him as well. So his numbers are a little bit misleading, but he hasn't earned a ton of targets either. Even in these last few games without Nico Collins, he wasn't necessarily getting a lot of targets. So there are pretty big concerns here still, where, yes, I'm sure the Texans would love to pepper Tank Dell with targets, but is he going to get open now, period, at all? But also now that he's the primary focal point in the passing game. So ceiling is higher, but I don't necessarily think the median projection moves all that much, especially against a good defense.
Yeah, no, I think that you're exactly right. Like that is the concern. It's like, if he's the only guy left, can they just double him? Like, I don't know. They're going to focus a lot more on Tank Dell. Like you said, 1.08 yards per run so far this year. Really, I mean, that's lower than John Metchie. Obviously, really small sample size for John Metchie, but just not very good in terms of yards per route run, which is a good catch-all metric for how efficient a player is when he's on the field. And Tank Dell has just not been great so far this year.
Which again, he does have some really big drops, which, on the one hand, it's like, well, he shouldn't have dropped it, but that will, throw off those numbers. But in his case, pretty drastically, because he's had a couple of wide open, deep touchdown drops.
Yeah. So at some point, you'd think it would correct. So I kind of like the captain ownership ultimately at around 8%. I think that's a number I probably get on top of. And then in the flex, I'm probably around where the field is, a little bit over 30% there. It gets really interesting after Tank Dell, because or really messy. I don't know how you want to look at it. It's either really messy or really interesting. We kind of have, I think it's just these three that we really, Steven Sims, I don't think somebody we're factoring in that much, but John Metchie, Robert Woods, Xavier Hutchinson. I think those three are kind of competing for the wide receiver 2 and 3 roles this week. And I don't know, it's a little bit tough to get a read on. So it is, for me, going to be largely an ownership game. I'm just going to, whoever is super low, that's the guy I'll lean in on. As of right now in the flex, Xavier Hutchinson projected for 19% ownership. He is 4,000. Robert Woods projected for 11% ownership. He is 3,000. Did I miss John Metchie here? John Metchie, 20% ownership at 2,800. So all of them getting some ownership now. Last night when I was writing this, Robert Woods was getting single digit ownership, which I really liked, but now it's a little bit closer there. I don't know. How do you feel about these guys?
Same page as you, where I think they're very similar in terms of range of outcomes, projection. Like the median projection on Hutchinson is the highest, and Woods is the lowest, but it's like a 1.5 point difference. It's very, very close. So ownership's going to drive a lot. Obviously, salary, like what you can fit into your lineup, is going to drive a lot. Right now, I do think it's interesting that Metchie is projected for the most ownership of the group. He is the cheapest, so that does make sense from that standpoint. But we have had Hutchinson running routes ahead of him. Now Hutchinson hasn't been earning a lot of targets, but so like from a talent standpoint, you could just argue that Metchie takes on a bigger role now. And again, I think he's fine, but I do think that when you have the most ownership coming into him, the least coming into Woods, like I think directionally that all makes sense, and it's what I would expect to see. But it also just makes Woods look like he's going a little bit under owned. Hutchinson looks like correctly owned, and Metchie looks a little bit over owned to me. Again, within an individual lineup, that doesn't mean a ton. You're just going to be mixing and matching these guys. But I do want to pay attention to the ownership there, because if the field does decide they're going to take like a big Metchie stand or a big Woods stand or whatever it may be, I would like to just do something else, because I think that essentially you're kind of drawing names out of a hat for who out of this group in a 1-game sample size has the best game.
Yep. Yeah. Well said. I'm just showing the route participation by a week here, so you can see the route share relative to each other. And as you can see, so first, worth noting that in week 4, when Tank Dell missed, it was Robert Woods who ran 69.6% of the routes, while Metchie was sub 9%, and Xavier Hutchinson 4%. So the first time we had one of these players out, it was Robert Woods. Now, obviously, wide receivers all play different roles. I don't think of Robert Woods and Tank Dell as playing the same role, but maybe they just like Woods best for that particular role. But it is also Robert Woods missed a couple of games with plantar fasciitis. I don't know if he was limited in week 5 by it with Nico Collins out. Sorry, Nico Collins left the game early in week 5. We then saw Xavier Hutchinson come in and run the most routes while Robert Woods is playing behind him. I don't know if he was limited already by his plantar fasciitis. But so it's like, okay, so maybe, this first in week 4, when Tank Dell missed, Robert Woods was the receiver they seemed to trust the most. Then he had plantar fasciitis, came back in a limited role. Maybe if his, foot is healing, they're going to use him more going forward. Or maybe he's just behind Hutchinson and John Metchie. Like you said, Xavier Hutchinson, if you look at the trends, Hutchinson and John Metchie, since Nico Collins has been out, Xavier Hutchinson's route participation coming up each week, 40% to 51.7% to 61.5%. John Metchie declining from 31% to 28% to 23%. But now we have Diggs out too, and John Metchie has had a better target share when he's on the field. So it's just a whole mess where it's like, okay, so if they have the same route participation, John Metchie and Xavier Hutchinson, you'd rather have John Metchie probably. I mean, ownership agnostic, because he's been a better target earner. But it's been Xavier Hutchinson. They've been running more routes. So it's just a whole, like, throw your hands up, play the ownership game for me, kind of.
Yeah. And also you have been getting more 2 tight end sets also. The last, obviously we're not on tight ends yet, but the last 3 weeks since Collins' injury, Dalton Schultz has still been running routes, right around 70% of the time in each game. But Cade Stover is up to 34%, 28%, 26% route participation. So you're seeing that as well. Just more 2 tight end route options. If you look, it's really tough with this team too, trying to like figure out who replaces who, because if you look at where they're running routes from, a lot of times, that's kind of how you answer this question. Stephon Diggs has been the number 1 slot guy this year, but he's only run 36% of the team's total routes from the slot. Tank Dell is second at 18%. Dalton Schultz is third at 16%. Every other player is 10% or less. Nico Collins, 9.5%. But then you look at the replacement guys. Xavier Hutchinson, 8.8%. Robert Woods, 8.1%. John Metchie, 5.1%. That's 33 to 42% of each receiver's total slot, total route run. So you don't have one clear guy that is like stepping up as the slot guy. You have seen Hutchinson take a bigger step with Collins out, but there's no like clear cut. Oh, Robert Woods is the slot replacement for Stephon Diggs. I think you're still just going to see a rotation here where Hutchinson obviously has a bigger role, Metchie has a bigger role, Woods has a bigger role, and Stover has a bigger role.
Yep. Yeah, exactly right. But all of them pretty interesting at low ownership. Like I think I'm going to be mixing in all 3 of them. Would you set any kind of rules for these 3 of like max 2 or anything like that? I guess you're
Probably
using
not. I don't think I'd really need to. Like, I don't think I'm gonna have like 3 of them showing up all that often. That I can't imagine what that lineup looks like. Um, yeah,
yeah.
and like I think they're all gonna be on the field enough and cheap enough that you know, you're just trying to get lucky on a touchdown with a couple of them, and obviously that can happen even if playing time isn't exactly how you want it.
Yep. You get into any Steven Sims?
Um, no, like
Yep.
1%.
Okay, and that's about what he's projected to get in terms of ownership. Just kind of a dart throw there.
We have had we have been trending in the right direction though for the kick, for the kick returner defense stat.
I mean, yeah, that's true. Who was it? Who had the kick
Last
return
week
for
it
a
was
touchdown?
Khalif Raymond had an actual touchdown and the kick return or punt return touchdown.
Oh,
Um,
and oh man, I'm
the
so
showdown
close
game
to
the
it.
other day, I don't remember who
Yeah.
it was, but it happened.
Oh, Kelvin Austin. Yeah, had both a receiving touchdown and
Yeah, there was that one, but then there was one a couple weeks ago too.
was there? Man.
Yeah, I don't remember.
So
I just remember
finally the
reading about
double
it. I don't
dip
remember who did
is
it.
hitting. Of course, it's like unless you do more, it's still just 6 fantasy points because you don't
Right.
even get a reception for return. So it's
Right. Like Austin and Raymond ended up being Raymond was main slate, obviously, but like they ended up being really good plays because then they also caught a receiving touchdown.
yeah. Anything else at wide receiver?
Nope.
All right, let's move on. Talk about tight ends. Dalton Schultz. So let's start with the Houston side. Dalton Schultz, the highest projection of tight ends. He's also 7,000, so pretty expensive. You mentioned Cade Stover already has been a little bit more involved in recent weeks. And then you have Tegan Kitoriano is the third option there for Houston. I guess we take a look at the ownership. So we have in the flex Dalton Schultz coming in at 25% projected ownership, Cade Stover coming in at 15% projected ownership. What are you doing with these tight ends? How do you like them relative to ownership?
Yeah, I think they both look decent. Dalton Schultz is actually, I think, the most under-owned captain play right now. And it's not that I think he's super likely to succeed. I have him at like 6.5%, but only projected for about 4. And I do think it's pretty easy to like make the bull argument for him. You are losing your primary slot receiver in Stephon Diggs, so you're talking about a portion of the field where Diggs is going to be running a lot of routes now being open for Dalton Schultz. He's been disappointing so far this year, but we do know over the course of his career he's a proven pass catcher. He has a good quarterback, so it's not like it's that difficult to envision a game where Dalton Schultz just has the best receiving game ahead of Tank Dell and whatever garbage Houston has behind him. It's not like he's probably the second most talented pass catcher on this team.
Could be.
I don't think there's a clear cut argument that anybody's better than him other than Tank Dell. So I think there's just that case where he does have a bigger role. The matchup for tight ends hasn't been great for the Jets so far this year, but they have done a better job limiting inline tight ends than guys that are split out. I do expect Schultz to be running a lot of his routes, not in line. So that is, it's been a pretty neutral matchup in that regard. So I do think Schultz at captain's going a little bit over or under-owned. I think he's going a little bit over-owned at flex. So it is a situation where overall, I think the ownership is pretty efficient. I just think that it's kind of skewed a little bit more toward flex than it should be. For Cade Stover, $1,600 price tag looks pretty good. I think he's going under-owned at flex. I think he's pretty correctly owned at captain where he's not getting any ownership. But I have him being optimal at flex between 9 and 10% of the time. Ownership coming in 7 to 8%. Again, I think you just see increased route participation here. You were seeing that anyway with since Nico Collins went down. And once again, considering where a lot of Stephon Diggs routes are being run, it just makes more sense that you have these routes in the middle of the field that need to be run. You can get that done with Dalton Schultz and Cade Stover. So I do like getting to Stover quite a bit as a value play.
Yeah, so Schultz, like the route participation not really changing, but the target share has been slightly better in games where they're missing at least one of their receivers. Haven't really seen him without 2 of the receivers. So I think you're right. Like he might be the second best pass catcher on the team. So could see that target share come up even more. Cade Stover, you can kind of see the split here in terms of route participation, just like goes from 5 to 14% for the first 5 games of the season. Last 3 is over 25% for each one of them. I wrote it up in the article, the exact numbers. 5 targets on 29.1% route participation over the past 3 games. The first 5 games was just 9.2% route participation and 4 targets. So more targets in these past 3 than the previous 5. He has not been the first read very often. So he was the first read. So of those 5 targets he's seen over the past 3 games, he was only the first read on one of them. But again, could see even more, more of the field and more usage without Stephon Diggs there. And from a yards per route run perspective, again, very small sample. So I don't really want to read much into it. But he was, I believe, yeah, he's the 1.7. Like that's really, really good for a tight end. Again, such a small sample size that you probably don't want to read much into that, but worth noting that he's been really strong from a yards per route run perspective, or maybe arguably worth noting, I guess. But yeah, it's an interesting call out on Dalton Schultz at captain. Hadn't given it much thought, but I think you're right. That does we could just see him get peppered with targets more than we're anticipating. Maybe the Jets do focus on Tank Dell and so that's an interesting call out for sure.
Yeah, I mean, what if the Jets just take away Tank Dell? He's the guy, the big play guy that can just beat them. They take him away. They're willing to get beat by anybody else. Dalton Schultz is probably better than all of these other receivers on Houston. And you just get there. This could also just be a low scoring game. Like, you have a banged up Houston offense. You have a shitty Jets offense overall. You have 2 solid defenses. And Dalton Schultz just catches 8 balls over the middle for 82 yards and gets into the end zone.
Right. And he's cheap enough that he doesn't even need to be the highest scoring player. So yeah, I like it. On the Jets, are you getting to any Tegan Kitoriano? Any interest there? I don't think has he shown anything? I guess he does have a little bit of route participation. I didn't even notice that. So he does the past 3 weeks. It's gone up each week.
Yeah, he ran 18% routes last week. That's actually interesting because again, you're going to get more 2 tight end sets. That is just good in general. Rising tide lifts all tight ends, and so yeah, I mean, he's still in that. He's showing up right now in that bucket of JJ Taylor, Steven Sims.
Yeah,
but I do think that so looking at sub 1K guys, JJ Taylor, Steven Sims, this guy, Malachi Corley, Irvin Charles, Isaiah Davis. I would rather play him than any of those other. He's the easiest one to just say, he's going to be on the field and do something.
Yeah.
Or not even do something. He's going to be on the field.
Yeah, right. No guarantee he does anything. He has 0 targets so far in the 3 games that he's played, but he's been running some routes, so kind of interesting from that perspective. Yeah, I guess I had not thought about playing him at all, but I'm a little bit yeah, maybe you might want to sprinkle him in. I don't know how many lineups, if I'd get to him in 30 lineups or so, not necessarily, but in 150, I certainly would get probably above the field as I usually do on the super low owned guys.
I don't know if I would or not, but
yeah.
If you're looking at a lineup and you just need somebody in this range, he's the one that I would click on first.
Yep, makes sense. On the other side, Tyler Conklin is the leader for the Jets tight ends. Jeremy Ruckert has briefly was showing a little bit, seemed to be more involved when Conklin was dealing with the hip injury, but Conklin I think seems to be over that hip injury. So Jeremy Ruckert's role has declined just a little bit. Anthony Firkser there as well. In terms of ownership at captain, we have Conklin at 2% projected ownership. At flex, Conklin coming in at, I missed him, 17% projected ownership at 5,600. So I guess we can start with Conklin. What are you doing there? Are you going to be close to the field?
Yeah, he looks just like another mid-range play. 5,600, 16% flex ownership, 1% captain, 16% optimal percentage at flex, 2% at captain. So mildly underowned in both spots, but for all intents and purposes, just efficiently owned. He is perfectly fine if you need a guy in that price range. I don't think there's anything that really stands out one way or the other.
Yeah, and I'll just pull up his usage. I think he said 4 targets each of the 2 games with Davante Adams. I wanted to check that, is he still retaining some target share? That's kind of, I think, right in line with the season average. He had a few weeks there with 6, 8, and 8 in the middle of the season before he started really dealing with the hip injury. So I think he still has a strong enough role there that I have no issue with the ownership. As you can see, the route participation has been pretty strong all year. And now he seems to be recovering from the hip injury. So yeah, the addition of Davante Adams has not completely made him a non-factor in the passing game. They're still throwing to him a little bit. So I think he's interesting. But 5,600, he's also expensive enough that he probably needs to do something. He can't just, have a couple catches. there was a while where he was like a $3,000 tight end. He's come up quite a bit since then.
Yeah, and the Adams addition is like I think particularly bad for somebody like Conklin because not only is Adams just clearly a proven wide receiver that's going to draw targets, he's such a red zone threat, and obviously that's where tight ends really shine because of size. But like Adams is just such a priority in the red zone that I think he is like the worst kind of receiver that you can add for a tight end's production.
Yeah. We got a note on Malachi Corley. So I'll just read off the quote from the 24th. So this is a week ago. Todd Downing said, I was a big fan of Malachi Corley in college. He's a dynamic guy with the ball in his hands. I think he's maturing and understanding this game as a profession, that it isn't like college where you show up and you're the best guy in the team and things just always go your way. I've been encouraging him to stay ready because you never know when your opportunity is going to come. We have an embarrassment of riches in the wide receiver room. Has he even been active though? Like
he hasn't run a route since week 2, 3.
Yeah, it's a thin bet, I think, on Malachi Corley. Maybe he could be more. I guess he was active last week, but just not.
I would prefer if he hadn't been active last week.
And then he was active this week, so you could know, like maybe he'll have a role now that he's active. But now it's like, okay, he was active and still didn't do anything. So, Eric, you had an MMA win. Did we talk about this?
I don't know if we talked about it, but yeah.
Nice. How much for?
Yeah, like it was like a 22K chop. I lost like 3K hedge betting against it, so made like 18, 19K.
Nice. All right. Look at you having yourself a fall. A lot of big wins.
Good weekend. Good couple weekends.
Jeremy Ruckert, again, I don't know. There was a brief period he looked like he was taking on more of a role, but that was when Conklin was dealing with the hip injury, down to about 17% route participation each of the past 2 weeks. Ruckert coming in at low ownership, 5%, 5.5% projected ownership for Ruckert makes him viable to me. Like, I think that seems pretty decent. What are you doing with Ruckert?
I got distracted by Brandon again.
I'll read off my thing. Here's what I wrote. Ruckert had 3 targets on just 5 routes run in week 8. So being targeted when he is on the field, but he had 0 targets on 7 routes run the week prior. He'd basically need to score a touchdown to pay off his price tag. He's just, to me, like a classic backup tight end where it's like, if he scores a touchdown, then you'll want him. If he doesn't, you won't.
Yeah, that's how I see it. Like 5-6% chance of being optimal. Like you said, not running a ton of routes, 17% last week, 17% the week before that. Again, having a big red zone presence at wide receiver and Adams doesn't do anything for touchdown dependent tight ends either.
Yeah, true. And then Anthony Ferkser also there. I don't know, kind of he ran probably 1 route last week, 3.4%, just not really involved. A worse version of Jeremy Ruckert, where he'll need to score a touchdown to pay it off, I think is how I'd say Anthony Ferkser is.
Yeah. Is Ferkser better or worse than the guy on Houston?
I take the Houston guy. Like, more of an opportunity to potentially see more work with Diggs out, whereas Ferkser, like, nothing has happened to make you think that he's going to get more work. Would you agree with that? Yeah. Defenses and kickers. We don't even know who the Jets kicker is as of right now. Do you have any strong stands on? I guess I can read off the ownership for defenses and kickers. Jets defense 3,400, 19% projected ownership. Texans defense 4,600, 17% projected ownership. Looks like Riley Patterson is the projected kicker for the Jets here, 15% projected ownership. And Kaimi Fairbairn 17% at 5,200. I don't know. I don't have any strong stands here. I feel like that all seems about right.
Yeah, so I have both kickers going under-owned right now. I use Zerline as a place kicker or as a placeholder. Obviously, I know he's not kicking, but he's the same price as both Patterson and Schrader, whoever the other guy is. So it was just easier to do that. They came in under-owned. Maybe the projection on Patterson ends up being a little bit lower than I have on Zerline, just because I assume Zerline's a better kicker. But one way or the other, right now, both kickers look a little bit under-owned to me, which I do think kind of makes sense in this game. They're both getting like they're like 18 to 21% ownership in my stuff. It's not hard to see this as a game where, both offenses kind of struggle to score touchdowns. Houston, because they are just so limited offensively. The Jets, because they are limited offensively for different reasons. So, you could just kind of see it devolve into one of those games where kicking plays a big role, and you're not getting a ton of ownership coming into them. Defensively, I think the defenses look pretty much correctly owned. prefer the Jets. They're $1,200 less expensive. They're going up against an offense that doesn't really have many playmakers left. So there is that. The downside, I guess, to the Jets would be you could see a more run-heavy approach from Houston, which isn't conducive to getting sacks or interceptions, obviously. So, yeah, I think both defenses are fine. I think both kickers are fine, but I do think that at least right now, and this could all change once we have like a confirmed kicker. Obviously, not knowing who is kicking for the Jets could just throw off ownership. But I do think the kickers look a little bit under-owned right now.
Okay. Antoine talking about his Corley play says Corley played 6 snaps and ran 1 route last week. Not being tracked by fantasy points did not give him credit for any routes run last week. I think if you use some other sites, they will count it as a route run. If you just are a wide receiver on the field during a passing play, like they count that as a route run, whereas fantasy points won't. So yeah, I mean, and also making an argument that they need some sort of change at 2-6. They could try something different. They could, but he's definitely like he could be inactive. It would not be that shocking if Corley were inactive for this game. Yeah, I mean, you're right. There's a possibility that they decide to make a change, but not being projected that way.
Yeah, like I agree. Like he's really cheap, and if you're playing like the lotto and you want to just be there the game that Malachi Corley's involved, like by all means. But from like a trying to predict it. The problem is like, yeah, sure, they need a change. Even if he were to replace, so like if he were to just like jump ahead hypothetically of Gibson, then yeah, he'd be a really good play because he's not going to get ownership, he's free, etc. But he still wouldn't be like that good of a play, and he's obviously not jumping Davante Adams or Garrett Wilson. He's most likely not jumping Mike Williams. So like,
yeah,
the best change he could hope for is being like wide receiver 4, I think.
Yeah. I don't know. It's certainly in play for a lotto type contest. Like you said, it's like but it's just a dart throw. Like you're trying to project forward that he is going to have more of a role without any like coach speak indicating that he could have more of a role, anything like that. So, but yeah, I think he's a fine play. I just wouldn't call him the best play at that ownership.
I would call him a very low probability lottery. If you wanted to argue and say that Corley is a better play than whatever that Houston tight end's name is that we were talking about, I don't have any real pushback. Because the bar is so low. If you wanted to argue that he's like an actual good play in terms of like probability of succeeding, I would say that I disagree.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to touch on just before we end, Brandon says Texans will probably lean into the run versus the Jets' weak run defense. I'm touching on this because I've seen it said multiple times that the Jets have that they're a run funnel. I think Noto wrote it in the expert survey that I did. I noticed that I was like, and I haven't seen any like none of the stuff that I look at suggests that it is a run funnel, which doesn't mean that it's not, but like just in terms of like rushing yards allowed, they have not allowed that many rushing yards. In terms of schedule adjusted, it's like a 10th worst matchup for running backs for Joe Mixon. So I'm curious, have you seen any indication that this should be a good spot for Joe Mixon against the Jets other than his usage? Because to me, it strikes me as a pretty piss poor matchup for a running back. And I haven't seen anything to dispute that other than I keep on seeing people say that it's a run funnel. I don't know. Do you think there's anything to that, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really looked from that standpoint. The argument that I would make for potentially, for lack of a better word, being a run funnel is that often when you get a receiving core that's really hurt, you just run the ball more. So you could just get a better run pass split for Mixon that way. Yeah, I mean, as far as it being a bad pass defense, like adjusted rushing yards before contact per attempt this year, Jets are bottom 10. Like they're not, from like a yardage standpoint, they're not, or a yards before contact standpoint, they haven't been bad at all.
That's a bad I was literally asking a question. It wasn't even a take. I was saying I'm not seeing any indication that they are a run funnel. Man, it's always fun talking with Brandon. Good to have Brandon Katz back in chat, just spewing nonsense. All right. That's going to do it for this show. I was pretty out of it for this one, Adam. I got to say, I set my alarm later than I usually do because I needed the sleep and still didn't really get to sleep. Hopefully I should have more energy by the time I do my evening show tonight, which will be about 85 minutes before the game starts. We'll have inactives and stuff for that one. Adam, what do you have coming up for people? Where can people find you?
You can find me on the Endgame Syndicate YouTube channel. I talked about it a couple times during the show, but I will eventually be doing some NBA stuff over there. doing my NBA tournament show like I was for baseball. That'll probably start next week, maybe the week after, just whenever I can commit to actually doing it most days out of the week. So I'll have that over there. My NFL stuff still available through Dub Club. The link is in the description below. That gets you the data that I use for Showdown. It gets you my game-by-game write-up for main slates, gets you the data for main slates as well, Discord access, all of that. And then also, Endgame Syndicate, the site. Also, very good Discord over there. A lot of good players in there talking higher level, intermediate to higher level strategy, answering questions, doing videos over there. The type of site that I wish had existed for most of my DFS career, because I can learn from people that have had a lot of success, made a lot of mistakes, and not have made as many mistakes as I have made if it existed earlier. So highly recommend checking that out, if you play at a relatively high level.
Yeah, definitely check out Endgame Syndicate, or for lower dollar amount, check out Adam's Dub Club. Those links are in the description of whichever video you are watching. Yeah, and I'll be back tonight for another show. Please, if you haven't already done so, subscribe to our YouTube channels. We're trying to grow these channels, so would appreciate any subscription, liking the video, commenting, all of that. Very helpful as we try to grow the channel.
TT Eddie also asked if I was doing NFL content on Sunday. Probably not. I haven't the last few weeks. It was just kind of getting in the way of doing stuff that I needed to do, because I am writing, like I said, I'm writing the game-by-game article for my Dub Club subs and for Endgame subs. And I generally do that Saturday night, Sunday morning, and it takes several hours. And then trying to do the hour-long show also, I was just rushing and making mistakes in DFS. So I kind of cut that out.
Yeah. And one more thing I'll say is, if you do have thoughts on why people think that this is a run funnel defense, comment below the video on my channel, the Flannelverse, because I kind of want to look into it more before my show tonight, and I don't really know what people are looking at. So if you have some reason to think that, I'm always open to hearing what people have to say. All right, but that is going to do it for the show. Thank you all very much for hanging out with us. I'll be back tonight. Adam and I will be back on Monday. Thanks, guys. Catch you later.